Good morning and welcome back to the Explicit Measures podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back.
Good morning, gentlemen, and a happy Tuesday to you.
It's a Tuesday. I feel like
indeed.
Every time I do like a training session, my brain's like turns to mush. Just like, man, I have to think so hard about all the things I got to say and all the slides and all the pieces that come together. It's good. It's enjoyable. I get excited about it. But man, I'm just like next day after, I'm like, man, I need like a break. 8 hours of training is a lot.
I assume you were talking about yesterday.
That would be yesterday.
Okay. Coming into today with the speaking hangover.
I guess. You're going to get a lot of like how-tos this episode, I guess.
Recently, I was talking about.
Exactly. Like, as in yesterday.
Yeah.
All right, jumping in. Main topic for today is we're going to address a mailbag item for today. Let's jump in and talk about the question. It's actually a mailbag from us this week. So we have a question around the integration of Dataverse and using Inside Fabric. Funnily enough, I actually just had this question inside my class. Yesterday was like, we have Dynamics data. How do we get it? I'm like, I think they just kind of work together. So we're supposed to be able to pull in things from Dataverse, which I believe is tables being built by Dynamics. So good timing of the question. But before we do that, let's just do a couple of quick announcements and promotions here. So since you listen to our podcast, we like you so much. We're here to save you money. So we're going to promote one of the really fun events. I went to it last year. It's called Fabric February. It's over in Oslo, Norway, I think is where it is. But you can go visit FabFebTips.com. So if you're in the European area and you want to go check out that conference, we have a 10% off coupon for you. Use FabFebTips. Oh boy, maybe I picked a bad name for that one. FabFebTips to get 10% off your ticket. So if you want to go join a lot of other Power BI and Fabric developers over in Europe, very good conference. I went to it last year. Super fun. They had great snacks. I guess they say it's snacks. And so they had great snacks the whole time with a lot of good food, really good people, great speakers. So it was super fun. So I'd really highly encourage you to go. But if you want, you can get 10% off right now. I think that lasts all the way up until October 24th. So you've got a couple days here left to use this code until October 24th. So the code information will be in the chat below. In case you want to see that, I'll also be in the description if you want to go use that discount code. So for the low price of free, you get a discount on something. All right, moving on. Tommy, you have an announcement that nobody wants to talk about, but go ahead.
I have a major announcement. I'm so happy I get to say this. The Yankees are in the World Series.
All right, moving on. Just kidding. Go ahead, Tommy. I'll let you have your moment, Tommy. Go ahead.
A lot of people may know this, but I am more of a Yankee fan than I want to be. My entire life has been living and dying by the team. And
I think I'm sorry.
I think so too. And I tell people, I wish I didn't care this much. So it's not, I don't know if it's an actual mental cognitive choice. We lost a crushing
therapy for this.
I think so. They lost a playoff game on, I think, Wednesday. And I remember going, I don't want to do this anymore. Like what that brings you to. But I told my wife, because we've never dated or been together since the Yankees have been in the World Series. Those two worlds have never overlapped. So I was like, you have not met me yet until
How does that make
Yankees last one? It's like the two worlds, like two friend worlds are coming together. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how I'm going to behave when the World Series starts. It just matters so much. So I am pumped. I need to say it. We can move on, but
continue. Share more about your feelings with the group here.
Listen, we could really diverge. We want to start going. We talk about Stanton and Soto.
Mike.
Explicit Measures podcast canceled. We're going to talk about the Yankees.
Therapy. This is Tommy's Yankee therapy session.
Yankee therapy session.
Tell me more. How long has it been since the Yankees have been in the World Series?
2009.
2009. That's a long time. You're very strong for lasting this long. I just want to mention
Every year there's
the resolve and inner fortitude that you have as a Yankees fan. It's impressive, Tommy.
Listen, the worst thing you can have is hope, and I'm filled with it.
All right. Moving on
congratulations.
along.
I'm glad your team is
We'll
in
continue to keep you updated.
World
Keep
Series.
me updated.
When does the World Series start for the rest of our sports peoples?
Friday
Sports
evening.
ball people. Friday evening. Got it. Okay.
Against the Dodgers.
The Dodgers.
Yeah,
that's LA?
Dude. LA Dodgers, yeah.
See, I know sports. I'm so good at this game. Easy.
Amazing.
Cannot wait.
All right, jumping into another kind of announcement we have. Tommy, you wanted to bring up a topic here, just kind of a news article here. There's a blog announcement from an AI share skill. What's this all about, Tommy?
Yeah, so announcing in public preview, our favorite term with Microsoft now, is the public preview of the share feature for Fabric AI skills, which this allows you to do if you've created an AI skill. You can actually now share it with colleagues, allowing them to query what you've created. There's some enhanced publishing, so they can add some descriptions, and there's version management. So that's all they have now. I was a little intrigued when I saw that it's a preview feature for just sharing, but I'm sure there's a lot of things going on around the system. But again, it'll be part of our list of the complete it or kill it episode that will be coming in the future. I feel like preview's pretty important, or sharing's pretty important here.
Isn't that the purpose of making an AI skill to begin with?
Or anything in Fabric?
You build it to share it. So why that's in preview, I'm not sure, but maybe there's other things, but there's a huge list of limitations on AI skill things. So I'm still not sure I quite understand what an AI skill is supposed to be doing, and like how does it bolt into your normal Fabric scenario. So I just got to maybe spend some more time understanding what AI skills. I haven't built any myself. I can't really speak to this area. Have you built any AI skills, Tommy, at all in Fabric?
Yeah, and honestly, I haven't spent a ton of time, or maybe I should spend more time, but I'm just going to go, okay, what's some of the use cases here? And I think that's where I'm struggling. So it's like, when you're going to start developing this, you really need to have that use case in mind.
It's actually very funny when you read this documentation, you see the AI skill switch must be enabled. And so I keep reading this as the AI kill switch is enabled. So I keep seeing
they can't do it.
AI kill scenario, the AI kill tenant switch, the AI kill sharing. Oh, wait a minute. It's skill. It has an S in the front of it. I don't know why it keeps maybe it's me being alarmed by the AI taking over all the things. But I haven't really spent a lot of time building the AI skills. So I'd have to figure out more of what this means to us and how we would leverage it inside our tenant.
Honestly, with all the limitations, since the AI skill itself is still in preview, it's so limited now that it's kind of intriguing to play around with, but there's nothing you can do here with production. There's nothing that that I would recommend releasing to an organization yet. Anything would be for beta testing or testing with the team, but not necessarily real world use cases because of the current limitations.
Gotcha. Makes sense. We don't know how much the AI skills actually consume compute units inside the Fabric either. So there would need to be some one of these things where we're bolting all these extra things onto Fabric. I'm kind of concerned as how many compute units does it consume, which means how much does it cost me at the end of the day. So that would be one of my main needing to understand points. Okay, excellent. Well, that's it for the initial announcements. We can get into our main topic today. Main topic today is going to be talking about dynamics. We actually have an article around this one as well. Data Mark does a great job he goes through some what we would call gotchas, some trips, some pitfalls of bringing Dataverse data into Microsoft Fabric. So maybe follow along with Data Mark's article, but we actually have a question directly from our audience. This is our mailbag for today. Seth, do you want to take it away and give us kind of a read off on the mailbag?
You betcha, Mike. Hey guys, I just said.
Oh, is it like the Norwal? Is that like?
No, I don't know if that's
Hey, you guys.
No,
yeah,
it's like
so that's not Elf the movie. That's Elf the movie, right? No, it's not that one.
I'm blanking right now. Just spoke with Mike on Teams about how I Mike, are you planting these questions?
I am not planting questions.
Okay.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute.
These are the comments and in the mailbag.
I'm everywhere.
Are these your workers, Mike?
These are AI. I'm the AI actually. So this is my skills AI.
All right. And sorry, I'm diverting from the question. Hi,
You're
guys. Just spoke with Mike on Teams about how I think there are more interesting topics, questions, and issues with Fabric related to backend stuff. Let's say notebooks, orchestration, Spark configuration settings, warehouse versus lakehouse, using Azure DevOps pipelines versus deployment pipelines. Lots of interesting topics to touch upon. For today, I'm curious if you've worked with Dataverse/D365 F&O data. How do you find the Synapse Link Fabric link to work? And what are your main recommendations for designing an analytics solution on Dynamics data?
Finance, F&O stands for Finance and Operations, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Just FYI. So sometimes people say acronyms. I'm not sure what they are. I have to go Google them, but I think I know that one. It's Finance, Dynamics 365, Finance and Operations.
F&O.
Well, let me just comment to the nature of this question, to where it came from. I think the point here is, I think a lot of topics we talk about on the podcast are very Power BI centric, just because that's kind of what we know. That's probably where we spend most of our time working with, interacting with. But I think now with the concept of Fabric opening up many other options, there's going to be more topics coming that are going to be in the Fabric space, data engineering, the back end. Where do we store data? What are the options here? But I also feel like I'm not sure if everyone, particularly everyone on the podcast, has had enough time to come to consensus on like one thought, one way or the other. Like one example, AI skills. Okay, I've heard about it. I hear that it's there. Have I been able to spend enough time in it to like really have a decision point one way or the other? Probably not. I probably shouldn't talk about it. So I think as we get more and more down this Fabric route and more people experience it, and more people do it, and we have more patterns of, oh, this works well, this one doesn't work well, I think we're going to continually try to expand the podcast into other things. And I think this is a good topic, right? Because this is something that's not really specific to Power BI, the desktop, the application. It's more about the other things that go along with Fabric and integrating data into Fabric. So anyways, I just want to comment on the topic. We're going to try, I think we're going to make more topics around Fabric related elements.
And I think a lot of that's dictated too by the work that we're doing. And I think we're seeing a lot more organizations going into Fabric related needed services too. So, and that's going to go, there's a catch, there's a gotcha, there's a good episode too. So a lot of this is, again, this is our real world, what we're actually dealing with. So
the real world. Brought to you by the Explicit Measures.
I was going to say MTV, but okay. So jumping in today. So what are your initial thoughts around Dataverse and bringing things into Dataverse from the Fabric realm of things?
Dynamics is a dear sparring partner of mine with Power BI.
Okay.
And so I have a long history of efforts to integrate Dataverse and Dynamics data and CRM data into Power BI pre-Fabric, and even now, like to your point, like getting questions around it. I think we see some sparse articles around here, not just kind of setting this up, is it's not as easy as it sounds because of how the CRM data is in a sense structured. It's row record based, not necessarily analytical based. So there's already some limitations there, but you would imagine that CRM data would be one of the more core parts of an analytical solution, but that's not always the case, or that's not really the case. And I think it's because of the barrier to entry or the limitations of getting that data in. We have Fabric now. We have now a different solution, because if you tried before to try to directly connect to Dynamics or Dataverse and have that direct connection in a Power BI semantic model, good luck. There were Power Query advanced things you had to do in just to get that data loaded. Mm-hmm. But we have shortcuts now. We have other ways with the Lakehouse where we can actually store that data. So I think that arises the question too, do we bring everything into Fabric from Dynamics? Do we have to? Do we need to?
I think isn't the point of some of these connections to keep data where it lives, especially with shortcuts?
I think that's the idea of shortcuts, is you're already paying for somewhere to store it in some other system, right? And for example, maybe you are I work with customers that are heavy AWS shops. They've got, and I call it, this is a term, I think I can't take credit for this term, but I've heard the term and it makes sense to me. I'll just relay the information that I've heard. They call this thing around the data gravity, right? The more data you make in a particular cloud or location or area, that becomes the gravity of what you are going to kind of center and build around. So customers that are in AWS, they're going to make, well, we have data gravity in AWS. What's the visualization tools that go with AWS? Because it's there, it's in that area. It's not going to be efficient for you to move or take on the initiative of moving terabytes of data between clouds to do what, right? You've already made infrastructure potentially. You have processes that are sending data to some location and it already exists inside AWS. Well, you're not going to rebuild all that. That's so much work just to move clouds just to get to the reporting solution. So like people are going to want to have their data where it lives, Google, AWS. I think, Tommy, you've worked a little bit with like the Google Analytics inside the Google Cloud. I mean,
Oof.
well, but you wouldn't think, I don't think, I would argue here, Tommy, you would not say, look, I've got all this marketing analytic data in Google because that's how we do our advertising and marketing. Google is the biggest marketing, AdWords is your thing. You're not going to say, I'm going to lift all that data out in raw form over to Power BI. You may aggregate it and then report on it somewhere else. What is it? Google BigQuery is supposed to help you kind of get through some of that to like summarize the data, and then from summarizing data, then you use it.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the Google Analytics and we're talking about Dynamics because it's kind of the same problem arises where
I think so.
With Google Analytics 5 or the new version 2, especially.
Wait, there's 5 now? I thought we just got done with 4.
4, whichever the new one is. The way
got
the
it.
data
like, I'm already behind.
The way the data is structured is poor. It is not meant as before where it was in a tabular form. Oh my god.
It's clearly operational. It's clearly like
operational, but it's analytical. Yeah. So it's analytical data.
It's event-based data.
So
and that's where a lot of people get kind of hung around is, oh, look, I have all these events showing up, but a series of events defines a session. A series of events defines a purchase. A series of events define these different things.
Play well with tabular models.
Well, that's not the point of a tabular model. Tabular model is like summarized, aggregated data. We already know what's going on. You have to shape it.
Exactly. And that's the same with also Dynamics and CRM data too. Even if we have the shortcut, right?
Okay, good analogy.
Yeah. So even if we have the shortcut, or if the data, you have the gravity in Google, if we have the gravity in another CRM system, well, the problem is that unless you're going to, again, work in that cloud, you have to structure this data if you want to do any analytical solution to it. And a considerable amount too. So I think, yeah.
I was going to say, I'm going to go back into, so I like this concept of where you're going down, Tommy. The fact that the data lives somewhere else. Maybe for those of you who are not quite comfortable with what Dataverse is, maybe we should just do a quick, I'm just maybe thinking for me personally, just maybe doing a quick summary of what Dataverse is and how that works with the interaction of all the Dynamics products, I believe. So my understanding is Dataverse is just a list of tables. It's a design of a system that may contain just tons of tables, customer lists, product lists, any interactions with customers. It's kind of a known structure of how a company potentially would run. The Dynamics side of things, and this is, I think, I'm going to play some naivety around this because I don't really know. Tommy knows probably better than I do. But Power Apps and Dynamics goes very well together.
Yeah.
And,
so,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's basically because Power Apps lives on top of Dataverse. Dataverse are copies of tables that are inside Dynamics. So that kind of all fits in my mind. My mental model is that's kind of why it makes sense. So, in my mind, this is probably oversimplifying things, but Dynamics is a series of Power App interactions to information that lives in tables. That's kind of what the system's doing there. Now, that's probably not right. It's not super simple, but I don't deal in that space a lot. I mean, I connect to it, but that's about it. So
yeah. Go ahead. I was going to say the real important aspect here especially when you're dealing with Power Platform and like you said, the common data model, what it used to be called, is all this, even though it is tables, and you're exactly right. But again, how it's actually engineered, it's, again, we call it record based. So it's meant to query one thing at a time, because I want to look up all the information of a single record.
Yes.
And that's what you're trying to do. So and it runs fast in the Power Platform, or
yes.
in a
correct.
Yeah, because
And my initial mental model was like, oh, this is just a big, it's just a big series of tables. It's like, it's all just one big SQL server, da, 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 da. Well, apparently that's wrong. It's not just one big SQL server with lots of tables in it. It's like a collection of lots of services that are all bolted together. It's like there's functions, there's Cosmos DB, there's SQL databases, there's, I don't know, whatever others, like, but it's almost like, I'm going to step back and say this again, kind of an outsider's perspective looking at it. It's almost like tables as a service. You don't care how they store it, but they're going to let you store groups of information with common known columns as a service, and you can make new tables, or you can make definitions of new columns inside those existing tables, kind of dynamically. It doesn't really matter, what the table started with. You can add 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 columns onto it, whatever you want, and now you have the additional information. And then what Dataverse is kind of doing is kind of like this, I'm going to call it, for lack of a better term, an API layer that allows Fabric and other tools to come in and talk to those tables. So Dataverse plugs in very nicely with Power Apps. So if you want to manipulate those tables above and beyond the scope of what Dynamics gives you, you can build a Power App on top of it, and you can bring the data together, and you can join it, and you can edit it. And so it becomes this editable item in those tables. Is that kind of a good summary here? Anyone else in the chat working with Dynamics? Is that how you understand it? Is there something I'm missing here? Feel free to put something in the chat if I'm off base. With that being said, around Dynamics and Dataverse, now it becomes, how do you get it to work with Power BI and Fabric? And I think that's been something Microsoft has been touting for a while, is, hey, look, just connect to it, bolt onto it. And there's this idea of shortcuts where Fabric can read those tables or have a shortcut to the information, but we're not actually surfacing, we're not copying the data over to one lake inside Fabric, is my understanding.
Yeah, and like I said, I think this is a really great place as we continue, because if have you guys ever tried to query like a CRM or a Power Platform table in Power BI?
Yes.
And
I've done more with probably Salesforce than I have, but that's more like API
CRM table
information.
Yeah.
CRM, it's the CRM table. So again, even with the shortcut too, I think there's even some limitations there too, right? Because your first thought is like, yeah, we want to bring in overall of our operations data, right? I might not probably want to pull in everything in your CRM, because that's usually incredibly large, like all your account-based information. And again, the gotcha, if you're just starting off here too, and you kind of made this point too, Mike, but it really needs to be emphasized. If you're envisioning the Power Platform or the Dataverse like a giant semantic model, you were very mistaken, because it doesn't work like that. So just saying, hey, we're going to pull everything over into from Dynamics into a lake house, well, it's not going to make a lot of sense, because of how what tables live where and what those purposes are. So I think just starting off with this question is, there really has to be some use cases in mind. This is not something I would do because we'll figure out a solution or a reason to have all of our operations data and all of our event-based data and all of our account-based information in Fabric, because even though it's a shortcut, well, you're still going to pay some cost. And then again, too, there is a lot of specific work you need to do on specific tables for any solution to make sense.
Go ahead, Seth.
I'm just trying to parse through what Tommy was saying. Like, go on.
Well, so I mean, I feel like the tables that live in Dynamics or Dataverse from Dynamics, they're supposed to be easily connected to. And again, I think connecting to them is pretty straightforward. I think the question in my mind is, what do you do with after the fact of that? What's the processing that needs to happen to get it into the kind of reports that you're looking to get into? And this is an area that I'm less familiar with. I've heard very clearly that Dynamics reporting is kind of trash in general. It doesn't really help you. It's not very useful. So at the end of the day, you need to have people who understand all the richness of all the tables and can figure out, okay, what kind of questions is my team going to ask about what this is doing? Now, I'm assuming finance and operations, very much finance-based information. I mean, this is where if I'm ever interacting with any finance team, it's typically quick. How can we get everything to Excel as fast as possible? That's where we need to be. We're going to be building tables and aggregations. We're going to build, where's our revenue coming from? How much expenses do we have? What does all that look like inside the operations and financing portion of the system? So being said to that, it's kind of about, okay, do you have a known design pattern to get the data out of finance operations into Power BI? And then I think the shortcuts make sense for connecting to the original tables. But I think there's going to be another bundle of work, or call it a black box, whatever you want to do. Some designing that needs to happen is from those shortcuts, what do you do? Right? So from those shortcuts, let's build out these series of tables. And so this fits in my mental model very well with what I would look in the lakehouse with medallion architectures. One thing I've been exploring a lot more recently has been what are the impacts and costs of using we have a lakehouse and we have a data warehouse. Data warehouses I have kind of stayed away from a little bit. I've just known how to build lakehouses and think that that's the right way to go. Trying to figure out what's the right spend pattern usage for warehouses. So figuring out where that fits in this ecosystem of things as well. And this might be one of those other opportunities, right? Warehouses are more suited for when you have structured table data coming to you. So bringing in shortcuts, connecting to those data, then directly jumping into making those enriched tables, joining tables together, making what you need to have, building star schemas is essentially what you're trying to do at the Power BI level. And so that's kind of where I'm thinking this is going to happen. You're going to connect to the tables. You're going to start there. But then what you're going to do is you're going to immediately need to have some engineering around that data, shape the data, bring it together, join multiple tables, maybe even add some of your own supplemental data because it doesn't quite match exactly what you want. But in my mental model here, anytime I connect to some sort of operational or CRM system, people just enter information in wherever they want. Sometimes the system controls it, sometimes the system doesn't. And what we do a lot in the data engineering space is figuring out, wait a minute, where does this data live? How do we join these two tables together? Because we don't have a clear connection between them. The system doesn't store it. We're going to have to build up keys. We're going to have to build up, matching elements, ways to match the data. This is, again, this is finance and operations. This may be different, but like if I have other systems, Google Analytics, website data, that stuff probably doesn't technically join very cleanly back to what I have in my dynamic system. So how do I identify a customer across both areas? Is there a global identifier for that customer? Each system is going to have its own unique identifier for each customer, but I need a central one that matches for everyone. So there's these major challenges, I think, that kind of come out of play here as you try and build out these data systems. And you have to think about, okay, what are you trying to do? What do you really want to report on? Start small, build what is adding value immediately. And then from there, you can keep exploring those tables and doing different things with it.
I think the value in the different types, right? If we're shortcutting or using the link, right? Like connecting to Dataverse or any other data source, the value of those special connections is not having to deal with the daily incremental load of data, right? It removes a part of your ETL. And it's a direct plug into the production system. Now, as with any data source, but I would argue, especially with CRM systems, right? Like, of course, we're building an abstraction layer, right? A business logic layer where we're combining only the relevant information that we need. And that's going to live in your analytics environment, regardless of what type of connection, right? That you can access the data, you can pull it in, you're still going to have to do that. It's just a matter of like, can you do it directly through not moving the data, or do you have to move the data? One other thing I'd like to point out is, yes, whether it's, Dataverse and Dynamics or, Salesforce, CRM systems are a challenge to work with typically because you normally don't get good architecture behind them. Right. And that's the biggest challenge. So in general, let's be honest, we aren't keeping a clean framework. Usually it's somebody comes in with a new idea, or, some new area of the business comes in that wasn't part of, and you can't scale. And then all of a sudden the column explosion happens and then you don't know what's being used anymore. Right. And I think that's what I've seen repetitively is just new people, new systems that have to be accounted for, and a system that wasn't designed to scale. And then it creates this very large problem to solve constantly. But I would say that in certain systems, I don't think reporting's horrible. I just think that the data that is collected within them is quickly moves into the realm of much more useful with other data coming from other systems. And I think that's where a lot of the value for the business comes in, is why we want talk about this being a primary connection for pulling data into Fabric, is because this is the stuff that, hey, can we tie these certain things to revenue or projected revenue or what's coming in through the opportunities, or et cetera, because then it's very enlightening, right, about how healthy your business is. And that's where I think a lot of value comes in with plugging into these systems, but with the promises of super fast, super easy, keep your data in the same place. With some of these connections, there are some gotchas, and I think that's where Datamark's article comes out or comes into play here.
Let's talk about Datamark's article, because I've seen this actually occur for many organizations, and actually I think this is a bigger challenge in general that people are not aware of. And this doesn't necessarily apply to Dynamics, but this applies, I think, in general. Anytime you have a cloud data warehouse somewhere in the cloud, this is something that you must first consider every time you're doing a Power BI project. So here's the article from Datamark. Datamark talks about there's a kind of a gotcha about using Dynamics data and bringing it into the Lakehouse. And I believe he's also talking about bringing the Lakehouse data into Microsoft Fabric as a shortcut. So a very specific way of loading the data. So jumping into his article, he talks very briefly about, okay, what is Dynamics? Dataverse to the rescue, kind of the story initially. Here's Dataverse, shortcut, get it into Fabric. Great, now you can work with the data, right? It seems very easy, but there has been some updates. But I think the challenge here is your Dynamics environment can get spun up where you tell it to get spun up. The Fabric environment, your default Fabric environment, doesn't necessarily get spun up in the same region. And I've seen this many times where organizations have made decisions to build in Azure, and they're in a East US data center for their data, literally the software that they're making or the hardware they're deploying is all in East US. For whatever reason, Microsoft just, when you sign in for the first time to Power BI just picks a region that it's going to go into that's closest to wherever I think the first person logs in.
Yes.
And it just kind of says, whoops. So if you have a company on the East Coast that was bought out and has some data centers on the East Coast, and you are logging in for the first time in Power BI on the West Coast, it'll pick a West Coast data center that's nearest to you, which makes sense. It's not a, hey, let's turn on Power BI, tell me what region you want to be in. And then it just kind of picks it based on where it thinks it needs to go. Cool, nice. It makes it easy for us. But then now when you start looking at costs of getting access to your data, connecting to your own data center, which already lives inside Azure, you now have to go between data centers. And there's this concept of an egress and ingress cost for your data centers. So as long as your data is inside a data center, meaning your VM for your SQL server is in the same data center as your Power BI environment, there is no cost to transmit the data across an internet connection, basically. Right. And so there's this concept of, if you don't think about initially, and again, this is a huge warning because I've seen a lot of customers just do this, and I don't think they even know that they're having costs. I think they just turn it on and be like, oh, it just works. Great. No one's even thinking about this. Now, for Fabric SKUs, you can move them between regions. So I can co-locate the hardware to run a Fabric workspace near where my data center is, so that works. But there are aspects of PowerBI.com that don't live in that area. Mm-hmm. What I don't know is, are there egress, ingress costs for that? I don't know. I don't know how to measure that very well, but I do know if you're using Spark, if you're reading and writing lots of Delta tables, that can get extremely, what I'm going to call quote unquote chatty between the Spark engine and where the files are going. So those things definitely need to be co-located in the same region. So if you're shortcutting to another data center, or you're shortcutting to something else and you're reading everything with shortcuts, there's a potential for a high amount of data going between data centers. So to me, when I hear the word shortcuts, I put in the back of my mind, hey, I really do need to check the location of where that shortcut is going to and where's my data center. So one, they're not like across the world, right? I'm using a shortcut from a west data center into an east Power BI environment. There's going to be some additional latency that goes across by sending data all the way across the US. Is it going to be? I don't think you can get around that. It's just physical things. So this is in my mental model. That's one of the things that Mark points out in this article. It says, look, if Dynamics doesn't exist in the same area as Power BI, you're going to have some problems. You'll need to co-locate your Fabric environment where your Dynamics environment lives. And I think this is a really relevant point. I see this problem all the time. Super technical, very in the weeds here on this particular issue, but it happens all the time. Almost every client I show up, I have to do an initial a movement or relocation of their Power BI tenant because something's in the wrong region.
And I think Mark also speaks to that. He's actually having to create another Fabric SKU to be in the same region as where their Dynamics data center was. And he talks about that solution as well. So migrating the tenant. Yeah, I mean, to your point, Mike, we can't control where our Power BI location is. And if you also don't have that ability to create that tenant, then again, you're kind of right off the bat not getting anywhere. Where do you want to go from here? Do you want to keep diving into from the gotcha with Mark?
I mean, I think that's for me the gotcha point. Just make sure you know where your tenants are, figure out where your Dynamics lives, and then make sure whatever you're doing for shortcuts that they're at least in the same region. So I think Mark kind of outlines the solution there, how to migrate, how to get, he talks about how to move your capacity, how to migrate your capacity, meaning take your existing content and move it to a new location. I don't really love doing that just because I don't trust that Microsoft's going to be able to get all the scripts working. It's a back-end process. It's a help desk ticket. And migration could take a long time if you're trying to migrate where your Power BI tenant lives. Could take a bit of time. You could just spin up a new capacity using a Fabric SKU. That's another solution. Or you can basically delete your Power BI environment and recreate it in a different location. That's the fastest option if you want to move between areas. And that's the one that I typically prefer when we're working with companies. We self-manage downloading hopefully a handful of assets because we're just starting out with Power BI. And then we basically delete, replace, don't keep the artifacts, move over to a new region, and then start from there. So those are the patterns that I've seen that seem to work fairly well. But we can move on to other things. What other things should we talk about for this Dynamics content?
I think I want to touch on what Seth mentioned earlier, because once we finally even just get the ability to connect, to your point, Seth, there's probably a lot of work that we're going to want to do once we have that data into Fabric, because, man, again, the way the tables are structured is there's a lot of custom fields. There's a lot of tables that are like 2-column tables that, again, make sense from a record-based system. But I remember the first time I was trying to build a solution when I got the request, and it was one table was what I again was thinking semantic model world was all keys. Like, okay, I'll just pull in all the product information. Well, product category was one table or with 2 columns, product name and then the ID. Subcategory, every other product column was its own table, because that makes sense in the way the record-based world. So just to pull in 5 columns, you would need 5 tables. So try to do this in a Power BI Power Query, not great, but there's a lot of work just to get a standard semi structure that you're looking for. And again, I think that idea that we've talked about before, going into this with the conceptual model first is integral, or you're going to be spending a lot of time and money just to try to find and explore and a lot of extra bloat. So knowing where you're going first. But I want to touch on, because we're talking about all the barriers and all the extra work, let's think of the use case or the point of if I'm in Power Platform, what I'm looking at, and again, what is that extra value than putting into Power BI? A lot of cases with Dynamics or Dataverse is opportunity based for like your sales team. I want to look up a customer information or account, look at their opportunities, look at what they last purchased. Or I'm looking at a quick snapshot of information, right? I'm going off of, with Power BI though, I think it's really integral that we're not trying to recreate their solutions, because it works fine. I mean, it's not necessarily a great analytical solution in Power Apps to look at my quick numbers, but it's fast and it's usually that quick thing that someone's looking for. So I think going into this, would you try to recreate just to look at customer information, or are we really going in mind with some intended analytical solution? I guess that's kind of which way would we go? Would we try to recreate it, or do we have some other kind of analytical thing, like a lot of things we want to combine this with?
I think that question fits into the way I worded mine, which was how does Dataverse fit into the Fabric, into what Fabric offers, right? Because if I've never used Dataverse, like personally, so get that out right away. I know about it, right? I know a bit about it, but if I'm just reiterating, going through what Dataverse provided as a solution, right? First, it was like the common data service. Now it's the Dataverse, right? It was for Power Platform, which Power BI was part of, and Power Apps are. And if that's the centralized location for business data, and I've got apps plugging into that, how does it, like, we've been talking about Dataverse as a data source right now, but really it's the platform that those business side applications are running off of. So this dovetails into your question. What are organizations supposed to do now? Like push Fabric data back into Dataverse? Or like if I'm going to extend the value of a Dynamics or system and say we're plugging it into other data within the system, and I'm building a data mesh in Fabric, and I've got domain owners and I want to go down that route, well, isn't that my source of business data for applications and for reporting? Well, or is it both? And that's just kind of where my mind is. Like, I'll leave it there and then I'll make another comment after.
Okay. So let me give you my interpretation of maybe kind of what you said and kind of how I view Dynamics as well. One, the running joke with Power BI people is Dynamics is just a data source for Power BI. So that's maybe one of the running jokes there. So I think with Fabric, we're getting more of this ability to do like a round robin of data, more so than just what we would usually do in Power BI, which is a read-only lens of data. I feel like a lot of times I would design things in Power BI that would be connect to Dynamics, connect to Google Analytics, get tables of data out, shape it to what I want, have a table of or tables or visuals or reports built on top of that information, give it to the business, they find value, and then they go back to the source system, Google, Dynamics, whatever, and make their changes there, right? So it's more like a lens into the world of whatever that system is doing. I think with the adventation of Fabric, two trends I think are emerging, right? I don't want to continue copying data because that's expensive. It costs more storage. It costs you more compute units to go get the data out of the system and bring it over. So I think there's this idea of shortcutting, or they're going to call quote unquote virtualizing your data, right? Making APIs go get the data for you, and then you just have a resultant table that you can go do reporting on top of. However, I also think there's a story around. So we've done a project where we have a Power Query data flow inside Power Apps that is loading data into tables that exist inside Dataverse. So in my opinion, I think of Dataverse as just a collection of tables. It's seriously a collection of tables that a Dynamics UI has been built on top of. And so that's why I like the idea of pairing. My mental model really equates Dynamics to Power Apps. It's literally apps built on top of table structure data, and you can then interact with it. You can then make a table inside a Power App. You can go find individual rows of data, fill out the items that you need. Dynamics has the ability of making like a sales pipeline. When this is done, then do this, then do this, then do this. So there's a lot more. I think maybe what I would call the Dynamics to me is the UI that runs your business. There's tables underneath that you support, but now with Power Apps, I can manipulate any of those tables or add other data or supplement it. So that's where my mental model kind of goes. My mental model goes to that direction. What we do in Power BI and Fabric now is, okay, do we have all the data in Dynamics? Are all the tables there? Do we need to build a Power App to look up, edit, or manipulate individual records? Because we can do that now. We can build a Power BI report. We can embed a Power App on top of it that lets you see data from Power BI, click on customer records or transactions information, which can then exchange the information over to the Power App inside the Power BI report, or the opposite effect, right? You can be in the Power BI, in the Power App application and embed a Power BI report. So you can pass data from the Power App into Power BI and say, look, filter this data based on this customer. There's the customer data in front of you. So you could have this kind of interesting interaction between the two pieces. And so I think my mental model is when you want to manipulate the tables inside Power Apps, in Dynamics or Dataverse, you're doing it with Power Apps. And so you're thinking of where can I put the Power App element and what am I supplementing graphically with the Power BI report, visuals, those things as well. So that's kind of how I see the interaction between the two. I'm not sure if we're quite there yet where Power BI is going to be writing or Fabric's going to be writing data back into the Dataverse. I think we very much can do it. I don't think there's any reason why we wouldn't be able to. And now with this whole real-time streaming analytics data, maybe we can detect changes from Dataverse and let people know when things are happening and getting real-time information about what's actually occurring in an operational system. I don't see a lot of blog articles around that yet. So anyways, that's just my initial impression. Even the whole sales marketing thing of Dynamics versus Power BI is totally different.
Do you back in the day, Microsoft had these templates that you could download that would connect directly to your sales, and finance data versus like, oh, cool. And you connect to this, and man, I don't know who created these reports, but
word.
Oh my gosh. It was maybe some of the worst looking semantic models. Initially, that was my first thought, but how they're structured, but the visuals themselves, it was like, what the heck?
What is going on here?
And again, I think because the idea here too is, okay, connecting Dataverse, great. Well, guess what? Again, these templates that Microsoft provided had 75 tables in them. And these were simple, get started. It was like get started with sales. They're like, I'm not going to get started with 75 tables in a model. Trying to make sense of this because, again, guess what? In a Power App or in a Dataverse table, and I know it's a table, but again, it's not the table. I think there's 23 types a column can be. And notice I'm not saying data types because that's not what they are. There's a lot of things called like lookups and not just yes, no's, but all these very custom fields that, again, doesn't play well when you're trying to think of this as a analytical solution. So I think the one thing we don't talk about a lot is not just pulling the data in, but with all the customization that you can do in Power Apps and how that does not play nice with trying to build a solution with Power BI, you probably have some Dataverse admin at your organization or someone who's managing the common data model. I mean, I don't know why you wouldn't start there. We're trying to have that conversation with them first rather than trying to pull everything in as is.
Yeah, I don't think you're ever going to want to pull things right out of Dynamics as is, ever. I mean, there's been no operational system I've ever touched where the data is shaped and ready to go for reporting. It's just not right, typically. There's always too many tables. The data is not consolidated enough. The dimensions that we're looking at is not spread across one table. It's just spread across 8 different tables. Like every dimension has its own, key value pair or indexing table, and everything's a GUID. I mean, my understanding is in Dynamics, every property is like a random list of GUIDs that attach to the property. You want to pick the city that the customer's in. That's a single list of a GUID and a list of cities. And it links to a customer table that has a whole bunch of other. So it's this really snowflakey, weird, optimized system for. It's a very optimized system for doing the transactional information, right? And that's just not how Power BI wants to see it. Power BI needs to see not all these snowflaking tables. We need to see a centralized star schema. And so I think Adrian is actually adding some really good comments and is affirming my understanding as well. He says here in the comments, syncing near real-time data to the Delta Lake helps out a lot. I would not consume the data directly from Dataverse, even if it's possible, because there's always additional modeling needed in Power BI. Again, me speaking not from Dynamics, other systems, 100% that's true. I mean, Seth, you've done a lot with Salesforce. Are you ever
Yeah,
taking
but
tables?
I mean,
to Salesforce?
even when I did work with Dynamics, and they both have the same thing, directly importing into Power BI, like you get this nested link nature that
Yes.
at first
Yeah.
glance, you're like, oh, sweet. Mm-mm. Right? Like no bad juju, right? Like you can't,
Yes.
in order to get at the data you really need,
Yes.
you need an intermediate layer, and I
Yes.
agree with that.
And I think Adrian also points out here as well, there could be 10 to 20 tables behind a single dimension table or a single factual table that you need. Again, it's the idea of like the system is built for operational data, highly, ACID transactions. It's going to be edit records as fast as you need to. Many people in the system not deleting records or not locking out records when you can or cannot do it. So there's all this kind of like safeguards around a system that can allow hundreds, maybe thousands of people interacting and adding data to it at the same time. That's a different data structure than I need a semantic model that is star schema. It's going to look different. And so because of that, that's what I was kind of trying to communicate earlier. And I think Adrian just did it better than I did in communicating this. There's always this black box of data transformations, figuring out what the shape of those 20 tables turn into so you can actually use it inside reporting.
I think what's interesting to me is if I look at Dataverse, right? It spoke to the business side being able to conglomerate, like combine a bunch of data sets into this business side universe. And I don't know if like that now with Fabric, I don't think the reporting side of that lives in there anymore. It would or will potentially for some things if you've already like built out and like restructured the data from your dynamic system, and then you've got reporting off of that. But now if I want to bolt that into other data that I also have in Fabric, are you really pumping that back into this directional, which is now more just an operational system to me? Or are you actually doing more of your reporting in the system that all the other systems are going into because it's more enterprise-ish, right? And that's where I'm still thinking about this, because it to me, it's not like where I started with the conversation, where I'm ending are in kind of two different places, because it's not just a data source, right? It is a system that business teams are using, and it's also like it could be a feed, a push and pull of data back and forth depending on how you're using Power Apps or Automate, or like those are all tools for the business to do some of the same things that we can do in Fabric. And now really is it, you just teach people how to do that in Fabric. I don't know. And it could be elite, but, and I'm not saying the whole Power Platform is, isn't relevant, but it's interesting how I think Fabric challenges parts of the architectures that were kind of presented as go get it in Power Platform, because it's not like Power BI is its own entity now. It's just the reporting front end, along with all the other horsepower behind it that are part of all of the Microsoft platforms for the most part.
There's an interesting comment here in the chat from LinkedIn, and I just want to read this one. They're talking about I think Power BI is still part of the Power Platform arena, because Power Apps. Thinking about Power Apps is connecting to existing tables, manipulating data, editing records, right? And then the Power Automate is like real time actioning on data and things. I would kind of argue, I think Microsoft has kind of moved Dataverse and the Power Apps and the Power Automate. It seems like that has continued to be the Power Platform of things. I feel like Power BI has now joined forces more with the data platform, and because it's now we've now moved Power BI closer to Fabric, and so I would actually separate that mental model. Yes, you can do Power Apps editing data in Dynamics. You can edit tables in Dataverse with Power Apps. Power Apps can create its own tables, right? You can edit SharePoint lists and edit other things with Power Apps. Cool, interesting. But I think my mental model is really shifting away from Power Apps as being part of the. I mean, it's its own Power Platform piece. Power BI has now migrated over to Fabric, which is now, I would say, purely data platform, because now it's pipelines, which were ADF, Spark, which used to be Synapse. We got notebooks now, which is totally a new experience, and Power BI is integrating much tighter with the Fabric world, which is data platform. And I feel like finally, for once, we now have a real true home of where Power BI should live, because it kind of had been living in
I
Power
agree.
Apps for a long time, and it was kind of like, well, hey, there's Power BI. This is a really popular product. It's in Power Apps.
Platform.
Power Platform. Sorry, my apologies. The Power BI is in the Power Platform. Okay, cool. But when Tommy and I went to the Dallas conference for Power Platform, and we were talking Power BI, there was like a handful of
3
us,
people.
and we were like, wow, we are very different than the community that exists inside
Platform.
the Power Platform group of people, which was way more dynamics, way more Power Apps, Power Automate. Like, those make sense.
Yeah.
Those products make sense together. We just did not fit in that area. And I think we were I think Power BI was initially lumped into that group, not correctly.
It actually wasn't initially.
No, it wasn't. It was its own thing.
Like, if
Power BI
anything,
was first.
It was SharePoint, right?
Well, yeah,
SharePoint BI initially.
I guess if you look at the back end of Power BI, all of that was data platform, and I honestly think, like, just from a structure perspective, it's always been viewed as part of data plat. What's interesting is Power Platform almost used Power, like, we didn't quite know, did Power BI move over to Power Platform? Is, like, what's going on? Is it part of data platform?
It was confusing.
And if anything, I think that was the first step for Microsoft going, like, yeah, Power BI is just a reporting tool, and we're going to plug it into the Power Platform. It doesn't belong there.
That's when our data and AI conference turned into, like, the Dynamics conference and Power BI.
That's just because we were trying to figure out where do we fit.
Like, we didn't fit here. This is not our fit.
Yeah,
I haven't felt like that since
advanced.
lunch in high school.
Do you remember this?
Yeah.
I remember going for the first 2 data insight summits, or whatever. The first 2 was all about data, Excel, BI. Awesome, loved it. And then what happened year 3? Something changed, and I was like, "What is happening here?" All of a sudden, everything shifted, and we're like, "Okay, we had Dynamics and Power BI." Like, and I remember teasing people about the conversation. We were like, we had a keynote, and there was, like, almost no mention of Power BI the entire time. And we got to the second keynote, which was like, then everyone started teasing, like, oh, this is the real keynote now, because this is really about data. And now it's just the Power BI keynote. So I think you're right on point, Seth. It's been a tool that we didn't quite know where to put it. I think now it's found its true home. And now that we have, like, an actual conference around the Fabric conference, which is solely focused on data, analytics, data science, I think it feels a lot more, the vibe for me going to the conference has been a lot more like the original conferences.
It does. I think we're also talking about, like, that from an MVP perspective, or, like, where you're speaking into audiences. But, like, to be clear, Power BI belongs in both of these ecosystems, right? It introduced to business users ETL and data modeling.
Yes.
And, like, the scale that you can create with reporting just above and beyond, let's throw a couple tables or a single table and some visuals into a report, which is what CRM is. Like, it's like, you want to build a report, grab your columns, and it'll automatically just dump out, like, a paginated report for you, or some visualizations, right? Power BI is an analytics ecosystem in and of itself, right? You open that PBIX, ETL, transform, data model, DAX, I can extend it, right? I can build reports on the same model. All of that scales. And I think it is very relevant to Power Platform and how you would engage and plug into the different data sources. I also think it's obviously very applicable to Fabric and all of the data and ecosystems and analytics from there. It's just, it becomes a conversation to me about the architecture of your data sources within an organization in this ecosystem that Fabric now encompasses. And if the direction is, hey, we're creating the full data mesh, how does a previous implementation from Microsoft, i.e. Dataverse, Power Platform, all the structures of data that support these tooling, work within this framework? And that's kind of where my mind goes. So I'm not implying that Power BI belongs to one of these particular areas. I think it's a feature that is extremely powerful in both a very front-facing business solution as well as the enterprise solution on the back.
And I know we're getting at the end, but I would be remiss to really mention, because, Mike, I think you highlighted something important here. everything we've talked about right now has been, I think, much on the technical side, on the logistics side. But to your point, Mike, going to that conference the first time, like, oh, there's a whole other world here in the Power Platform that I was not aware of. And I think before even beginning this project, you have to understand that the people who are living in Dataverse and living in the Power Platform, they have, it's as like transitioning to Power BI, even for them, because of how they're already consuming data. This is very much a start at the end. I'm not going to start doing this because I just get a random request to bring this data into a reporting solution because of all the Upwork. Because again, these people, the people and the departments who are living in Dataverse have some solutions on the way that they are behaving with data. And unless I know that my solution is going to become one of my top 5 solutions at the org, because I don't even have, I need the business case that we're transitioning and we're moving people to look at Power BI. They're looking at data where we're doing it, because again, it's not like they're devoid of any of the insights that they need. I'm not necessarily reporting,
Correct.
but because they're like, I need to look at an account, edit, but they're going to try to do the same thing in Power BI. And I think that's my kind of closing thought here is you have to start here at the end where I need the business case that the organization needs, that I know people are going to be consuming this dependently. They're going to be dependent on this solution, or it makes no sense to me.
I like your point there, Tommy, and I think that's exactly a point I would make as well. Start with the end in mind. Start with asking the questions of business. What do you need to do? What do you need to see? What information you're trying to go after? And then work your way back in there. And if it makes sense for you to do a lot of your data engineering and shaping of information inside Dynamics or inside Power Apps, then do it. That's fine. That's totally the acceptable solution here. And then, do a little handshake or, final output reporting into Power BI. That's also okay. So we've seen it. The neat part here is it does couple very well between Dataverse and Power BI. It does make it very easy for us to talk to both tools together. It makes it easy for us to absorb data out, import it into data models, and use it for your customers. So I think it's a very compelling story, and I hope they continue to remove friction, make this easier to work with. My only final thought that I would add here would just be very mindful of where your Dynamics tenant lives and where your Power BI tenant lives. You're going to need to, especially in Europe with the GDPR laws and all that compliance information, you're going to need to be very careful around where are you storing the data. I need to make sure you co-locate your Power BI and your Dynamics assets in the same area, just from compliance reasons, even for that matter. Well, that being said, I think we've done a pretty exhaustive discussion around this. Hopefully this added some value. I feel like we kind of wandered the conversation around a lot around Dynamics, because some of us have experience with it, but some of us we don't have a ton of experience in Dynamics and connecting to things. But I'll say it again. Dynamics is just a data source for Power BI. So figuring out how to get it in there is probably easiest for me. I've probably angered all the Dynamics groups at this point.
Poke.
They're not listening.
Poke. Anyways, thank you all very much. We really appreciate your ears. We know that your hour of time is valuable. We hope this conversation was, interesting to you and gave you some value for your day. You can have some more conversations with your leadership around Dynamics and integrating with Power BI. We hope that worked well for you. Anyways, we only ask one other thing is please go to the Fabric February conference using FabFebTips to go check out the conference. You can go get 10% off. We'll just push that again one more time. Awesome conference. Great to go meet some people there at the conference. Highly recommend it. You can visit fabricfebruary.com. That's the website for that. With that, Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
You can find us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to subscribe and leave a rating. It helps out a ton. Do you have a question, an idea, or a topic that you want us to talk about in a future episode? Head over to powerbi.tips/podcast. Leave your name and a great question. Finally, join us live every Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. Central, and join the conversation on all the Power BI Tips social media channels.
Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.